everyone, and welcome to this session. Thank you all for joining us. So great to see lots of friendly faces today and lots of you that have been on the CMO Series Podcast. So thank you all for coming. Today, I'm very lucky to welcome Gemma Lyon, Head of Marketing Communications at Macfarlanes. Hi, Gemma, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you, and you?
Brilliant, yeah, great to be here. We're going to be discussing, and I'm Charlie, in case you didn't know, from Passle. So I manage and produce the CMO Series Podcast here. And today we're going to talk about a tale of two podcasts. So I'm going to talk about the story behind the CMO Series and why we launched it. And Gemma's going to delve into the Macfarlanes Podcast and talk about how that fits with our digital marketing strategy. So hopefully some interesting takeaways for anyone looking to implement a podcast within their firm. So here's just some of the things we're hopefully going to cover off and some takeaways for you today. We're going to look at the key success factors of producing a podcast and what it takes to be successful. How to identify your audience and your topics. And Gemma's going to talk to us a bit more about how to leverage influencers on your podcast. The importance of effective distribution. As Sam mentioned in the session before, we have a philosophy at Passle called COPE, which stands for Create Once and Publish Everywhere. So we'll talk a bit more about that. And why feedback is a value add when feeding back on the impact of your podcast. So to kick off, let's talk about the CMO series. We launched in 2021. I think Connor covered some of this off in his introduction, so thanks, Connor, for stealing my thunder there. But we featured over 150 guests across all of our episodes, including some specials. As you can see, that was our 50th episode. That's culminated in over 350,000 listens across all of our platforms. So it's really kind of snowballed, and we're in a great place with it today. So the CMO Series Podcast is a standalone podcast, but we've also recently launched CMO Series Represents, and I'll talk more about that in just a few moments. But the series began as a way to hear from all of you, people like you, senior marketing and business development leaders, CMOs, within professional services marketing, to hear your unique insights and perspectives on what's going on in your day-to-day roles, because only you can provide that. So that has really been instrumental in producing this content. So thank you to everyone that's contributed to that so far. So why we created the podcast in the first place? Obviously, it was kind of just coming out of the pandemic. There was a massive opportunity, as you have all probably experienced within your roles in legal or professional services marketing. The shift towards digital became much more, it was really accelerated during that period. Everyone went online and started producing webinars, and podcasts is just one of those mediums that people kind of turn to. So now in the UK, 21.2 million people listen to podcasts. So there's a massive opportunity, and that's still growing. 40% more people listen to podcasts now than before the pandemic, and 48% listen to podcasts to learn something new. So there's a massive opportunity, and as Sam mentioned in the previous session, from our general counsel research, we know that people are consuming content while they're not sat at their desks. So they're commuting, and this research also shows that most people are consuming podcasts while they're traveling or commuting. So that's when they're consuming this content. So that kind of sets the scene. But creating a podcast and getting to this point we're at with the CMO series doesn't come without its challenges. So how do we build it? We sought insight, as I mentioned, from leaders like you within the industry, and without that valuable insight and those unique perspectives, we wouldn't be where we are today. So it was really your kind of opinions and perspectives on what you're doing day to day in your roles that make it so insightful and valuable to our audience. We distributed it everywhere. I mentioned COPE, so we create it once, but we publish it everywhere. The CMO series actually started with one interview, which was published just on Passle. That became one interview per quarter, published on Passle, to one interview per month. We now publish one episode per week, which is published everywhere across all of our channels. So that's on Passle, it's on JD Supra, Lexology, LinkedIn, Twitter, every channel we have available, we push it out on newsletters. So we do kind of encourage everyone, if you are looking to produce a podcast, think about where you're going to publish them. And by doing all of that, we've really built a community. So the CMO series was a great way to share your learnings and your lessons from your roles with the wider community to help move that forward and move the industry forward. And we've done that with the CMO Series Podcast. And in March this year, we wanted to celebrate International Women's Day. We'd already run a couple of specials on the CMO series, and we thought we'd run a special for that day as well. So we reached out to a number of women across the community to see if they wanted to record with us. And we were overwhelmed with the response. We had almost 60 women come on to speak to us about their experiences within the industry. Some good, some bad, some mixed. But what we found was that really resonated with everyone. And so we had 5 to 6 hours worth of content, way too much to put into one special episode. So we had a chat internally. We'd already talked about doing a podcast that focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so it seemed like the perfect time to launch CMO Series Represents, which you can see up on screen now. So we launched that International Women's Day content across a series of 6 episodes as part of CMO Series Represents. And that had great engagement and lots of people kind of getting involved with on LinkedIn. And we've continued that. We've actually spoken to Diana Lauritsen, a CMO over in the US. She spoke about the role of race and how being a woman of colour has impacted her career and shaped how she leads her teams. And then yesterday we actually just launched our 8th episode of CMO Series Represents with Roy Sexton, who you may all be familiar with. He's LMA President 2023, and he's Director of Marketing at Clark Hill, also over in the US. And he came on to talk to us about being part of the LGBTQ plus community and how his experiences throughout his life have shaped his career and how he leads. So definitely worth checking those out if you haven't already. But we have learned some lessons along the way. As I mentioned, these things do come with their own challenges, and we've kind of learned as we've gone. We produce our CMO Series podcast in-house. We produce, edit, and distribute everything within our team. So just a few kind of takeaways that might be helpful for anyone looking to build a podcast and the lessons that we've learned that may help you. We always suggest to book a scoping call or a meeting with your guests before you invite them on to record. And that scoping call really helps to understand what they're passionate about, what they're facing, the challenges or barriers that they're facing within their roles, and how the topic they're going to speak on. And by doing that, you really kind of see what lights them up and what's going to be most insightful when they come on to record with you on the podcast. So we highly recommend doing that. And following that, we also have found from our experience that digging into the detail of a specific topic is really important to get to those really insightful nuggets of information that are helpful to the audience. What we found is kind of doing the more strategic and top-level topics are fine, but they don't necessarily give you those really interesting insights that our audience can take away. So don't be afraid to get into the detail of a subject. And then lastly, we now provide tailored feedback to everyone that comes on the series. So this is just an example of our 2022 results of the podcast, but we provide a one-page feedback form for all of our guests that come on to just demonstrate how they're helping kind of move the needle and take the industry forward by coming on and sharing their insights. So again, it's something we recommend doing. It's also part of our 4 pillars, which we're having a panel discussion later today on. Well worth staying on for that. But providing relevant feedback has been really impactful. And internally, to your internal stakeholders, that's also a great way of demonstrating how valuable this kind of content marketing is in your mix. So that's the CMO Series podcast. Now, hello Gemma, we're going to dive into the Macfarlanes Podcast. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So first up, how did the Macfarlanes Podcast come about and where are you at now?
Well, I think we were probably a little later to the podcast party than some of our peers. When we were smaller, we favoured more direct conversations with our clients. But as we've grown, we've added podcasts to our content mix as another way of talking to them. So we launched our first one in 2021, similar to you, when we're all in lockdown. And sorry, I lost my train of thought. We were all in lockdown, and I think people turned to audio to combat screen fatigue, and we needed a mechanism to get our information out quickly and easily, so it was easy to get everyone on a Zoom call, record it, edit it, and distribute it. So we launched for the first one in 2021. Our most popular series is our Policy in Practice, which isn't easy to say, and that's led by David Gork, who is our head of policy. He actually trained at the firm, worked at the firm in the early 2000s. He left to pursue a political career. So he worked under Theresa May in a number of different roles, including Lord Chancellor. And then we rehired him in 2019 as our head of public policy because of his expertise and profile in that area. He's usually joined by one of our heads of policy from our practice areas and a subject matter expert from across the firm. And he's interviewed politicians and other heads of business across a range of topics. Since the first one, we've now done 20 episodes, so it doesn't quite compare with your 108 or whatever it is, but and since then it's really gone from strength to strength. We've got another series which is our Women in Real Estate series. So we created that to highlight the success of women in real estate, which has traditionally been quite a male-dominated area. We've got one which is a monthly roundup of employment law highlights, which people-led and is so naturally quite interesting. And then we have a fourth one, which I'd actually forgotten about, which is our Coffee With, which is an internal podcast series, which we use as an internal comms channel for talking about various happenings across the firm, introducing new partners, that kind of stuff.
Fantastic. Actually, we also do a people podcast. So Sarah Marwood, our HR lead here, hosts a people podcast that we share internally as well. So no, brilliant. Thank you for that. And how does your podcast, we talked about it being part of the kind of content marketing mix. Yeah. How does it fit and align with the rest of your content marketing?
So I think similar to your GC survey, our clients are telling us that there isn't, well, I think the general sentiment is that law firms aren't doing enough to produce this sort of timely, relevant content. So it's very much about looking at our thought leadership, looking at how we can chop it up across different mediums. And I think the great thing about podcasts is it allows you to get a better sense of someone. So in terms of personal brand building, it really helps to help on that front. So we put it into our content mix for as much of our content as we possibly can. Brilliant.
And I guess in terms of your approach to outreach, obviously your guests tend to be in-house. You've got David Gork that kind of hosts it. Yeah. How do you, I guess, approach the guests and the topics that you're going to cover off?
Yeah. Well, with the Policy in Practice podcast, which David heads, we're obviously able to leverage the relationships that he has to find relevant topic experts externally. And also to promote the podcast series itself. And then internally, we in marketing help to align the right internal subject matter experts with the topic for the purposes of personal brand building. And then with regards to topics, we for that same series, our heads of policy meet with David and marketing on a weekly basis. Where we discuss hot topics, upcoming legislation, government activity, that kind of stuff. Yeah. So the budget, upcoming party conferences, and that forms our calendar of content. And podcasts can be, on a range of different topics. It really depends what's topical and also what our clients are telling us they want to hear.
Sure. So with that kind of influencer, it's quite interesting how you kind of use David Gork and that influencer marketing within that. How has there been any barriers or kind of challenges that you found with that approach?
Well, I think influencer marketing isn't a new concept. It's been around for centuries, but I think we are seeing a greater investment in influencers by professional services firms. And sometimes that might be someone who has grown through the ranks and raised their profile, which firms leverage. Other times it's more of an outward-looking activity to see to find the right person with the right profile and brand to marry up with what it is you want to promote. So for us, it was very much a moment in time, forward-looking activity to see what we needed for, say, the next 5 years and find someone who was the right fit. And that's where we landed on David. So he really helps us to demonstrate our advisory capabilities. In terms of challenges, I'd say none that I can really think of, although I guess in any instance when you're trying to assemble a bunch of very busy people and align schedules, it can be a little bit like herding cats sometimes. We've got one podcast at the moment that we actually still haven't recorded. It's been rescheduled 8 times. Yeah. Thankfully, it's not too time sensitive, but we have a number of people across the marketing team now that can produce podcasts. Yeah. So that's where, by sort of spreading the love across the team, we've got others to pick up when things move.
Yeah, I think it's a good point actually, and it's something that we've kind of learned over time is having that schedule of content and those recordings kind of done in advance, so you've got recordings kind of booked and edited and ready to go to fit with your publishing schedule, so that kind of comes in time, doesn't it? I think. Brilliant. And I guess you mentioned your clients and how they kind of influence perhaps some of the topics and the relevant kind of newsworthy topics that you cover. How do you kind of actively get that client feedback, or is it just kind of anecdotal that informs that?
I think it's probably a bit of both. Our topics really do vary. Like I said, with the policy and practice, that very much kind of covers what's topical in the government space. But our lawyers are obviously out talking to clients all the time, so that's a good way to generate content ideas. Sometimes it's we've got a campaign running, and say we look at all the different ways that we can chop that content up, and podcast forms one of those channels. But I think with the podcast, sometimes actually we'll get an idea for an episode from when we're recording another one. The conversation will go on to another topic, and we'll think actually that would make a good future podcast.
Absolutely, we tend to do the same as well. Brilliant. And so we talked a bit about distribution earlier and how at Passle we kind of publish it once, but then we distribute it and push it out everywhere. How do you approach that at Macfarlanes, and how do you kind of extend the reach of your brand?
We take a similar approach. We take a multi-pronged approach. With David, he's obviously a very active person on social media, both in his capacity as a political commentator, so he's an avid tweeter, but also in his capacity as head of policy for Macfarlanes, he's active on LinkedIn for us. So we obviously publish on our firm-wide LinkedIn channel. We actively encourage our contributors to share across theirs. We are hearing increasingly from our future lawyers that they want to hear how we're demonstrating our expertise. So we publish on our Instagram account. We send a couple of emails across the firm, one once the podcast's published, another as part of a weekly roundup of client engagement opportunities. So that includes all of our links to our thought leadership. We put it onto our intranet. And for anyone who doesn't proactively go onto our intranet as much as they should, me included, we send out a weekly email of activity across the firm, which again includes links to our thought leadership. And then obviously for the relevant topics, we share it with our clients and other audience groups across the firm. And one thing that we are trying to do more of at the moment is that relevant content, your COPE strategy of when we're creating more insights on a topic, linking our podcasts, linking back to our podcasts, so that syndication process and really trying to broadcast in as many places as we can.
Brilliant. And have you found that you mentioned the lawyers who feature on the podcast kind of sharing it across their LinkedIn profiles? Have you found that's kind of shifting? Is that becoming more of a thing? People are trying to build their personal brands through sharing podcast content, for example?
Yeah, I think so. I think certainly for the Policy in Practice series, our contributors have got quite used to, being on the podcast quite regularly, so they've got used to sharing on their channels, and it's sort of become second nature now to share other content they're doing and that of their peers. And we find we get more traction when our contributors share links to the podcast and their other content than when we in marketing badger them to send it out. So that seems to work quite well.
I guess it's that kind of competition element, isn't it?
Yeah.
Kicks in and people want to compete with their peers, which is good news for you and the marketing team. So we talked a bit about how we feedback and report on the podcast at Passle. How do you approach that at Macfarlanes?
We obviously track metrics, so we look at website page views, we look at how long people are listening to the podcast, and also track listens on Apple and Spotify. And we were looking at it recently, actually, and 2/3 of our listens actually come from Apple and Spotify. So that's people who are proactively seeking out our content rather than accessing through links in emails or on social media. So we found that it's as much about promoting the podcast series itself as focusing on the distribution of an individual podcast. Yeah,
no, that makes sense. It's it sounds like you're kind of almost building the Macfarlanes podcast as a standalone brand that's generating its own kind of followers, which is great. Do you have any examples of how anecdotal, but how it's kind of helped building the brand of either the firm itself or the lawyers?
Yeah, so I think personal brand building is core to any expertise-driven business's marketing program. And in the past, we've, as a firm, probably been a little hesitant in really pushing personal brand building in favour of a one-firm strategy. But I think by putting the effort into individuals and what they want to be known for, it indirectly raises the profile of their team and the firm itself. So with our Policy in Practice series, it's raised the profile of our heads of policy. And while it's not them per se that we want to raise the profile of, I think by having David at the helm and with the following that he has and the engagement that he creates, it indirectly raises the profile of their teams and our advisory capabilities.
Yeah, brilliant. And this is what we like to ask all of our guests that come on the podcast, so it's only right that we should ask you today. What's your one piece of advice for other marketers looking to extend their brand through podcasting?
I would say do your research and have a plan. I think because podcasts are so easy to produce and run, our lawyers certainly, they look at what their peers are doing and want to do the same. So they'll come to us and say, we want to do a podcast. And when we say, we ask them all the standard questions, including, what do you want to talk about? Often they haven't quite got that far in their thinking. So they're jumping to the channel first. And when we bring it back to topic, objective, audience, often we'll agree that a different format might work better. And our role as marketers isn't to drive content, it's to have those robust conversations and find the right appropriate channel for their content. So, in terms of research, we're always looking at what our competitors are doing, where their gaps are, how we can demonstrate our expertise in a way that stands out from our competitors, and where we want to innovate, where we might be happy to sit back and be second or third, for example. And then on the planning side, I think frequency is key with podcasts. So it's important to have a timeline of good content and your contributors lined up, because as we're seeing from our listens on Apple and Spotify, podcasts can help to build that loyalty and keep people coming back to listen.
Brilliant, thank you. So I think we have a few moments. Thank you, Gemma, for that. It was very interesting. And I hope there's been some helpful takeaways for you all today. We do have a few minutes left if anyone has any questions about how to build and implement podcasts. Yeah, Connor will just bring a mic up to you.
Hi, I'm Anna. I work at a Portuguese law firm, and we also do a lot of podcasts. And I was thinking about the challenges you mentioned. And one of them is the production and the editing. You mentioned that it's quite easy to edit and produce podcasts. However, we don't have the internal capacities, we're outsourcing them. And it's a hard process because we also tape our podcast, because the video component seems to be very important. Do you have a video component? How do you feel about that? And regarding editing, is it better to have a kit at home and do it yourself? Or is it better to have a more professional and hence to suffer a little bit on time sensitivity issues? Which is the best balance? Thank you.
Well, I don't know, Gemma, if you have a view, but I'm happy to.
Our in-house design team does ours. You might be better answering that.
Well, so we also produce and edit our podcast in-house, and that's generally me that does that. So I'm very aware of the kind of time it takes to do that. I guess I have in previous roles worked with agencies that will do that for you, and I agree with you. Obviously, you've got a longer turnaround time and not so much control, and also having to kind of feedback if there's other bits that you want changing all takes time. So I think capacity is an issue, so it really depends on if you have the team that can do it, but if you can upskill, someone within your team to learn how to edit a podcast, then I think that's always good, because I think once you can do the job yourself, it's easier to kind of critique and if you're working with an agency, it's easier to manage. There are lots of kind of software tools available for editing now, which are free or quite cheap to use. So it's worth exploring those, and I can talk to you later about what we use in more detail. On your first part of the question, can you just remind me? The video, yes. So we tend to, we have done video. We tend to stick to audio only. I don't know, Gemma, is yours audio? They are, aren't they? And again, we have done video production, but that, again, the video element does take a bit longer to edit. So I guess you really need to weigh up how much of a difference that's making in terms of your listenership. If they're listening to it via Spotify, Apple, or one of those, they're probably not watching the video anyway. But you need to kind of assess that based on your kind of stats, I guess. But I think if you're struggling with capacity, you want to do it in-house, maybe start with audio for anyone else thinking about it, and that's kind of a bit quicker and easier to edit. And you can create nice visuals that go alongside it quite easily as well, which is what we do. So I hope that answers your question. Oh, it's just one that come. Good question. Do you have a view on this, Gemma?
I would say no more than 20 minutes max. Okay. We look at our listener stats, and when we recently produced a podcast on AI, which was, embarrassingly to say, 55 minutes long. And we really tried to recommend breaking it into two and have it into, a two-part series. We didn't win that battle, and our stats show that it was just too long. So I think 20 minutes is quite a good length to get a decent discussion or Q&A or whatever it is. And also sort of back to your GC report, looking at when people are consuming this kind of content, it works well on a commute or a morning at home or whatever.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. I mean, our podcasts tend to range from 20-something minutes to 30-ish minutes. We kind of don't edit them to be a very specific duration, but around that length is probably about right. We have also produced episodes that are a lot longer, and we've tried kind of splitting them and doing a 1 and 2 parts episode. And what we found with that is that often the first part will get the impact, and then when you release the second part, it doesn't always kind of get the same impact as the first one. So there's a few things to weigh up, but yeah, 20-ish minutes, I think I'd agree, is probably a good time.
I think what you guys do quite well is you have your takeaways at the top of the page, and then you have a transcript, which is, I think, helpful for the longer podcast, so that if someone sees the length of it and they don't want to listen all the way through, you can kind of skim and jump in at a point if you that's of interest.
That's a good point, actually. We didn't talk about transcripts, but if you are producing a podcast, we do kind of recommend that you think about producing transcriptions from an accessibility point of view, but also if you publish those on your website, they can really help with your SEO as well. And I guess a kind of extra bonus that we have seen off the back of doing them is that guests that come on sometimes kind of copy and paste a snippet of the transcript onto their LinkedIn posts when they're sharing it. So it's quite a nice way if you're if you're writing any articles or you're kind of doing any promotion around your podcast, you can kind of pull out some of those nice quotes from the transcript. So that's another good point. Simon, did you have a question?
Can I ask a question? I'm curious to know whether you think a panel session or just a one-to-one interview provides more powerful content.
Well, yours tend to have several people on, don't they?
Sorry, could you just tell us that question?
Oh, sorry. Simon just asked, do we think that a panel discussion or a kind of one-to-one Q&A interview works best as a format?
We have done panel discussions. I think the optimum number is probably 2. I'd say no more than 3, just because it's difficult then to hear, understand who's talking.
Yeah.
We try to keep ours at maximum of 3.
Yeah, and our podcasts tend to be a host and one guest. So we have thought about doing a panel, but I agree it can become confusing, and also that if you're recording over Zoom, which we tend to do, kind of the cues as to who's going to speak when can be a bit trickier. We have done a few where we've had a couple of guests on from the same firm that are perhaps part of a team, talking to our hosts and doing a Q&A, and they have worked, but again you're then at risk of them kind of becoming much longer episodes again when you have 2 people on. Hi. Hi.
Sorry, can I give you this?
Hi, I was just going to ask, have you done any training for internal contributors, and how do you overcome that sort of sense of fear that lots of internal people have participating?
Yeah, I don't know, that might be best for you, but I mean...
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. No, we don't, but it's something to consider. With David, he's obviously he's well versed in talking about government policy. He's a very confident speaker anyway. So in terms of editing for most of his stuff, it's a pretty easy job for us. I think some of the contributors we've had on that series have already got quite strong personal brands already. So again, like David, they're quite confident speakers already. But yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly something that we will consider, because we've had some podcasts where we've had to do a few takes to get it right.
And I'd say for us, you know, our hosts tend to be our kind of sales team, and they're all, you know, with practice have become pretty well versed in doing it. I guess with the guests, as I mentioned in the presentation, that initial scoping call, and having, you know, some of our hosts will have a couple of calls with them before we record, and just kind of help build that relationship beforehand, and kind of set their mind at ease, and that really helps kind of relax them if they're not used to kind of recording with us. I was going to say something else, but yeah, it's I think it is what, you know, some people naturally can kind of just come on and do it in one take, and that's great. But often you do sometimes kind of hear the nerves of the guests come through. So I think, yeah, if you can provide any kind of training, and also just kind of recording them and sharing them within your internal teams without kind of public, you know, just to practice, is probably a good thing to do.
And starting with some warm-up questions, we find usually helps
Yeah.
just to relax people a little bit.
That's what I was
straight in.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know if you've listened, but we do our kind of quick fire round in the podcast in the CMO series. So that we've actually started to do that at the beginning of the recording with the guests, and that just helps kind of ease them into it, and kind of also kind of relaxes them, and we get to know a bit more about them as well, which is quite nice. Thank you. Any more questions? Or one more?
Hi, Matt from Burgess Salmon. Just a question on, obviously you've mentioned about practice and editing and people warming up, but how do you have like a set policy, or how do you decide where to draw the line between authenticity and sort of a more curated, edited output? Because some are obviously more polished than others, or you might want to push the production in a certain direction.
I think we'd always favour authenticity over anything else. So, yeah, we do sort of quite little editing really, and you know, with using podcasts as part of our content mix, I think you can, you've got other channels and ways to chop up that content. So I think we would always favour authenticity.
Yeah, and I'd agree. We don't kind of tend to edit ours for content necessarily. It's really just the kind of pauses and any errors. And I think, you know, podcasts offer that opportunity to hear more authentic voices and opinions. And that's kind of, I think, what's helped the CMO series being successful, I'm sure, for your podcast as well. So I think you kind of want that natural conversation. You don't want it to feel too corporate or too edited, I would say. And you know, you have other content streams for that.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
you have articles and things that can be more formal. So yeah, I'd go authentic. Thank you. Connor will just bring.
Hi, Catherine Knock at Hassan's in Gibraltar. Cast your mind back to 2021. We've just started our podcast. We've done about 17 episodes in the last 3 months. Do you remember when you first started, in your, say, the first week of the first episode, do you remember what you considered a good listen rate? Because I'm still gauging whether it's really rubbish or whether it's actually okay. I'm not divulging my numbers until you tell you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, Gemma.
I'm not divulging, Anna, especially after seeing their 350,000, so I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, no, I mean, Sam, our director here, he was there at the kind of inception of the CMO series, and I joined just a few months later in 2021. So, Sam, can you remember the first numbers of Podbean downloads? What 30 maybe?
First episode of the CMO series had 2 listens.
Oh.
One was Connor and the other was me. And then we did that, and then we did a second episode and a third episode, and it got better and better and better and better. So.
And I think that's the key, and that's what we'd say is really over time, it's that consistency that Gemma talked about, and that kind of frequency. It doesn't matter if you're not publishing it once a week, you could publish it once a month or once a quarter, but knowing that that content's coming up and that your listeners are expecting to see that, and just continuing that consistency over time that will snowball, and those numbers will gradually, we've seen, the graph just goes up and up and up. So it really does take time. So yeah, try not to be, if you do start one and you're thinking, why have we done this? Then do kind of give it time, and that, I'm sure that investment will pay off, and you'll see that grow.
I think at Passle we also think about who's listening to it.
Yeah.
It's all great having 350,000 listens, but actually we want the CMOs of the people in this room listening to it. So actually we could get 400 listens, and that would be great if it was the CMOs of all law and consultancy firms.
Yeah, it's a good point, and we talked a bit about objectives and why you're doing the podcast in the first place, and I think that's what it all comes back to. Before you might have a lawyer that says, well, someone else is doing a podcast, we need to do one. And as Gemma said, you have to have that conversation of why are you doing it, who are you trying to reach, what are you trying to achieve. So when you're producing it and you're planning it, think about who you're trying to reach, what you're trying to say. And as Connor said, it might not be the big numbers that you're looking for. You might be looking for a very select few people that you want to hear it. So definitely worth thinking about. Okay, I think that's all we've got time for. But thank you everyone for listening. Thank you, Gemma, for joining me. And we're going to be around for the rest of the day if anyone wants to grab us and ask any more questions. So thank you very much.